My name is Geraldine Thomas, and today I would like to talk about how language is bound by context and culture. First, let's define language. According to our textbook, Interpersonal Communication, written by author Corey Floyd, language is defined as a structured system of symbols used for communicating meaning. This system of symbols, or language, is by nature symbolic, arbitrary. It is governed by rules. It has different layers of meaning. It varies in clarity, and today I would like to focus on how it is bound by context and culture. As some of you may know, I am a native Spanish speaker. I grew up in a Latin American culture where people generally tend to be very expressive and very talkative. As I communicate day to day with my husband, who is from Indiana, my communication style often reflects my cultural background. When I asked my husband to describe my style and how he perceives my communication, he mentioned that, for example, I tend to say things, and I quote, louder than they need to be, that I use more words than needed to get my point across, and that I seem to overreact and get very emotional over very small matters. So, are these differences in culture a result of the Spanish language that I natively speak, or are they a result of the Spanish culture where I was raised? To explain this dynamic between culture and language, anthropologist Edward Sapir and linguist Benjamin Warf proposed the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. On page 150 of our textbook, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis states that it is language that influences the way that each member of a culture will see the world, and also that the attitudes and behaviors of a culture is reflected in the language they speak. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is based on two principles: linguistic determinism and linguistic relativity. Linguistic determinism states that a person can only experience a reality that is determined, defined, and limited by the native language they speak. In other words, it is language that determines their reality. Floyd says, for example, to imagine a society where they do not have the word for envy. According to linguistic determinism, that society, that group of people would not ever experience envy because they don't have a word for it. Linguistic relativity states that because language determines the perceptions of reality, different cultures will see the world differently. Each culture would experience a different reality. Warf, in his research of the Hopi Indians, found that in their language, they do not make a distinction between nouns and verbs. Therefore, Warf concluded that the Hopi Indians viewed the world as constantly in motion. There are, however, three criticisms to this hypothesis. The first one is against linguistic determinism and the cause and effect influence the language has on culture, because it could also be true that it is a culture's worldview and their understanding of reality that could influence the language that they use. The second criticism is that one does not need to have the symbolic word for an experience in order to have the experience. So take, for example, a small child that exhibits jealousy, and they may not know the word for jealousy yet. And finally, handicapped people that aren't able to use language the conventional way, they still have thoughts, they can count, they can interact with others, and if language determined thought, this could not be possible. These criticisms don't render the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis completely wrong. They just point out that language may not shape thought quite to the extent proposed by Sapir-Whorf. On page 149, Floyd points out that studies revealed that individuals who speak more than one language, their perceptions can change based on the language they're speaking at that moment. Students in Hong Kong expressed more traditional Chinese values while speaking Cantonese as opposed to when they were speaking English. So in conclusion, language is bound by context and culture. Cultural values are reflected by the native language spoken, and language influences and reinforces cultural values. So when we learn about a new culture or we learn a new language, we can expand our own view of reality and our own perceptions.